Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome back to AJ 102. And tonight's lecture is going to be on Chapter 10. We're going to talk a little bit about terrorism and homeland security. And as always, please do yourself a favor and take a look at the definitions for the chapter that are going to be listed under page 382 or on page 382. There's not that many of them, but again, looking at those definitions and then looking them up in the book really does help you get a better idea of some of the topics that we're going over. Along with that, don't forget to take a look at the Do You Know section, which is also at the top of page 382 in your textbook, that asks some questions. And if you can kind of look at some of those questions, they will definitely help you with some of the information that's going to be on the quizzes or the subsequent tests. So this chapter is going to begin by defining terrorism and explaining the nature of what they call asymmetric warfare. Next, we'll look at the classification of terrorist acts as either domestic or international, and we'll kind of look at the differences between those, and we'll look at the various underlying motivations for terrorism. We will explore the evolution of terrorism briefly and some of the methods that terrorists use. We'll also have not really a discussion, but we'll touch on the U.S. response to the attacks that occurred on September 11th, 2001, and the very, very critical role that public safety played in the national response to terrorism, including the police officer's role as first responder and investigators of terrorist acts, as well as a little bit of discussion on the terrorists as criminals. So we hope to get through a lot of information in a short period of time. Excuse me, and we'll see how much ground we can cover. So defining terrorism, well, that's a tough one, but by way of introduction to the chapter, the events on September 11th, 2001 added a new dimension to American policing. Because typically up until then, it was kind of the war on drugs. But now, in the advent of this, law enforcement had to start strategically rethinking public security procedures and how they deal with certain things. And completed and attempted terrorist attacks present a very significant, difficult challenge for law enforcement. So, excuse me, let me give you kind of a scenario to set the stage for what I'm talking about. So, you would think that the city that I worked in for many, many years in my career, so it'd be Rialto, California, so it's in San Bernardino County, and population of a little over 100,000 people with a police force of about, say 108 to 115 officers. So in the south end of our city, we have what we call a tank farm. And these tank farms are huge tanks, if you will. And if you look, you can go to Google Maps and you can actually look them up. But there are probably 50 or 60 of these very large, huge tanks that supply jet fuel to several different airports and places throughout California, throughout Las Vegas, parts of New Mexico, and even parts of Arizona. So it's kind of a fuel processing type and storage plant, if you will. So when you start looking at strategically rethinking public security and those targets in your town that could be looked at by terrorists that want to make some type of a statement, even in little old Rialto, if you will, those are things that we had to start looking at. How would we respond to a major incident down there if something were to take place? So that's kind of what we're talking about. So, again, not as large scale as some other places, but every police chief and and leader in the organization has to start looking about targets that could be targeted by terrorism, both local or international or whatever. So here we go. The war on drugs was typically and was a top priority and had been a top priority since the 1970s. However, on September 11, 2001, we all call it 9/11, as a result of the terrorist attacks on America, this priority changed. The war on drugs, at least for a moment, took a back seat to the war on terrorism, as both the FBI and the U.S. Customs Service have made terrorism their top priority. The horrific events that occurred in September, that day in September, added a new dimension to American policing. Experience now tells us that the first responders to any future terrorist incidents will most assuredly be local police, fire, and rescue personnel. As a result, law enforcement officials must now strategically rethink public security procedures. So, when we respond to these big events, how do we do it? And as indicated on the slide here, completed and attempted terrorist attacks present a significant, difficult challenge for law enforcement. And while this book talks quite a bit about 9/11, since then there have been many, many terrorist acts around the world, up to and including something very, very localized most recently on, December 2nd in the city of San Bernardino. With the terrorist attack that was there. So I would invite you to look that up and look at some of the video clips of the incident. If we get time, we'll try to go through it in a little more detail. So how do we define it? Now, while there are a couple of different definitions, even within the U.S. government, agencies having different functions in the battle against terrorism use different definitions, with no real single definition that's universally accepted. The definition used by the FBI, which is stated in the Code of Federal Regulations, reads, terrorism includes the unlawful use of force and violence against persons or property to intimidate or coerce a government, the civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. So in these types, in this definition, we have to understand that there's a systematic use of physical violence that's going to be there. And this definition is applicable to non-combatants to create a climate of fear. And what I mean by that is that it's not like you would watch a war movie on TV and you see side A versus side B. Maybe that's the mindset, okay, even though there's some other ideologies and things that we'll talk about later on. But it's the attack against non-combatants that causes this climate of fear, because that's where the terrorists want us to be. So living in fear. Most definitions of terrorism include the systematic use of force of violence, which I just talked about, either actual or threatened against non-combatants to create that climate of fear and cause, again, some religious, political, or social change. The 22 U.S. Code 265 6F subsection D subsection 2, and that's in your book, defines terrorism as the premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. Now, three elements of terrorism are, and we'll kind of talk about that. And then there's a fourth one, sort of, but I'm going to give you three here to start. Three elements of terrorism are, number one, it is criminal in nature. Number two, targets are typically symbolic. And number three, the terrorist actions are always aggressive and often violent. A fourth characteristic of terrorism is that it is often an effective tactic for the weaker side in a conflict against a much more powerful adversary, giving terrorism a distinct asymmetric slant. So asymmetric warfare, I'll give you the definition to kind of help you with this, is conflict in which a much weaker opponent takes on a stronger opponent by refusing to confront the stronger opponent head on. Does that make sense? So that's why those little attacks. Okay. Desert Storm in 1991 was the last conventional war fought by the United States when it pushed Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. In Iraq, Afghanistan, and other troubled spots around the globe, the U.S. military has been confronted by guerrilla warfare, if you will. Basically, asymmetrical warfare. Instead of confronting regular armies, American troops now typically face insurgents and terrorists who fight with whatever they have. Asymmetric warfare, as I talked about a second ago, is described as leveraging inferior tactical or operational strength against the vulnerabilities, I'll get it right after the third try, of a superior opponent to achieve a disproportionate effect with the aim of undermining the opponent's will in order to achieve the asymmetric actor's strategy's objective. So basically, in this new kind of warfare, a weaker group strikes at the superior group not by attacking head on, but from the side, from the back, in places where you least expect it, causing great psychological shock. So in this asymmetric warfare, we just kind of mentioned it. They use guerrilla tactics, not attacking head on, the psychological shock of what took place, basically giving power to the powerless. And in this, what we've started to see come out of this, and what's been there for a while until we were able to really identify it, is that asymmetric warfare often involves the use of what they call sleeper cells, groups of individuals designed to basically stay hidden or sleep, if you will, until they are called into action. So a group of terrorists who blend into your community, that might have regular jobs, do regular stuff, appear to be regular folks, until they are called upon to do whatever it is that they're to do. And that's kind of the definition of what a sleeper cell is. So classification of terrorist acts, well, the FBI categorizes terrorism in the United States as either international or domestic. And international terrorism is foreign-based or directed by countries or groups outside the United States against the United States. The FBI divides international terrorism into three categories. The first threat is foreign state sponsors of international terrorism using terrorism as a tool of foreign policy, for example, Iraq, Libya, and Afghanistan. The second threat is formalized terrorist groups such as Lebanese Hezbollah, Egyptian Al-Ghams, Palestinian Hamas, and Osama bin Laden's Al-Qaeda. The third threat comes from loosely affiliated international radical extremists who have a variety of identities and travel freely in the United States, unknown to law enforcement or the government. And, on February 23rd, 1998, Osama bin Laden declared a jihad, which is a holy war, on the United States, calling on every Muslim to comply with God's order to kill Americans, and having publicly stated that his global terrorist groups intended to kill 4 million Americans, including 1 million children. So Osama bin Laden was put on the FBI's most 10 most wanted list in connection with the August 7th, 1998 bombings of U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Tanzania. So you can see how these things kind of grow, if you will. So that's international terrorists, okay, or terrorism. Now, more homegrown terrorists, if you will. In the years following 9/11, it was first thought that radical jihad was unlikely to find fertile grounds in the United States, where the Muslim population is among the most integrated and assimilated in the world. But the more recent events are driving home the message that it only takes a few homegrown jihadists to create a serious threat. So recent examples of alleged homegrown terrorists include Nadal Malik Hussain, the Virginia-born Army major who reportedly yelled Allahu Akbar, an Islamic explanation meaning Allah is the greatest, as he went on a shooting rampage at Fort Hood, Texas, which took the lives of 13 Americans and injured another 31. Another example is naturalized U.S. citizen of Pakistan or Pakistani descent, Faisal Shahzad, accused of the failed Times Square bombing attempt in May of 2010. Now, most recently, again, talking about the San Bernardino attack, they're still sifting through a lot of that to figure out whether it was a direct connection through, radical jihad, that formulated itself outside of the United States, or was it something that was done here, localized by radical jihadists? So, more to talk on that a little bit further down the road. So, although homegrown terrorists often lack the training and resources to attack high-profile and well-protected facilities, they are perhaps the most difficult to detect. Again, talking about the recent events in San Bernardino, nobody ever thought that something like that would ever happen that close to home. And a lot of times we don't even think that. We always think that these big things happen somewhere else. So, again, just food for thought. So, domestic terrorism. The events of 9/11 shifted the FBI's focus to international terrorist groups operating inside the United States, but not to the exclusion of domestic groups that threaten the safety of our citizens. The FBI defines domestic terrorism as activities that involved acts dangerous to human life that are a violation of criminal laws of the United States or of any state, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily within the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. So, today's domestic terror threats run the gamut from hate-filled white supremacists to highly destructive eco-terrorists to violence-prone anti-government extremists to radical separatist groups. So domestic terrorist groups include, I just kind of went over them, but I just want to make sure I get this to you, white supremacists, black supremacists, militia groups, other right-wing extremists, left-wing extremists, pro-life extremists, animal rights activists, and environmental extremists. So those are just some of the groups that are out there. And then the last one here for classifications would be what they call the lone offender. So similar to international terrorism, domestic terrorism is often committed by what they call a lone wolf offender. So a single individual driven to hateful acts based on a particular set of beliefs without a larger group's knowledge or support. In some cases, these lone offenders may have tried to join a group, but were kicked out for being too radical or simply left the group because they felt it wasn't extreme enough or violent enough. The lengthy bombing spree of the Unabomber, as well as the pipe bomb explosions in Centennial Olympic Park during the 1996 Summer Olympic Games, highlight the threat of what we would classify as a lone bomber with deep hatred of something or someone. A more recent example of a lone wolf terrorist was ex-LAPD officer Christopher Dorner, who in early 2013 set out on a killing spree to basically take revenge on the law enforcement community he felt had wronged him. So that in itself is the lone offender and is a classification of terrorists. So what motivates terrorism? So, I mean, there's a lot of things, but motivations behind terrorism, they vary a lot. According to the Terrorist Research Center, a terrorist group seeks to do kind of a lot of things. Well, number one, produce widespread fear. Number two, harass, weaken, or embarrass government security forces. Steal or extort money and equipment, discourage foreign investments, influence government decisions, free prisoners, satisfy vengeance. So, that's one. Most terrorist acts result from dissatisfaction with a religious, political, or social system, or policy, and frustration resulting from an inability to change it through acceptable nonviolent means. Religious motives are seen in Islamic extremism. So political motives include such elements as the Red Army faction. Social motives are seen in single issue groups such as anti-abortion groups, animal rights groups, environmentalists. Ecoterrorism is typically perpetrated or done by domestic groups consisting of environmental extremists who resort to violence to meet their objectives. Narcoterrorism includes both international and domestic groups that exploit drug trafficking to fund their terrorist objectives. So, I mean, you can just kind of see the motives and the changes as we kind of walk through some of these different things. So now we're going to kind of move on to the evolution of ideology. Now, in your textbook on page 390, there's a figure that at the top, figure 10.1, that talks about the process of ideological development. And I'm not going to walk through the whole chart, but the ideological development of terrorism may go through a 4-stage process as illustrated in that chart that I was just talking about. This ideological transformation, referred to as radicalization, follows a social and psychological path and becomes a terror issue when the behavior turns violent. So the author in your textbook here, and in this particular paragraph under this ideology, White in 2012 notes that most people who hold radical views are not terrorists. Radicalization can occur through several mechanisms, such as by having direct contact with terrorists and terrorist groups, either within the United States or abroad, through online contact with other radicals, or by undergoing a process of what they call self-radicalization. So terrorists may use arson, explosive, bombs, weapons of mass destruction, whether they're biological, chemical, or nuclear, and technology, as well as kidnapping, hostage-taking, shootings, and murders. Although armed attacks occur more frequently, in 2011, bombings resulted in the highest number of fatalities. And on the next page over in your textbook, 391 shows the number of attacks and deaths by attack type through 2011. So kind of keeping the part about the bombings going a little bit though, of the previously listed methods, the ones that I just talked about a second ago, some experts suggest that incendiary devices and explosives are more likely to be used because they are inexpensive and easy to make, noting the devastation caused by the IEDs or improvised explosive devices in Iraq, Afghanistan, and other places. So by far the most dangerous emerging threat to our homeland defense is the criminal and terrorist use of IEDs. Cheap, lethal, and low-tech, the IED has been the weapon of choice for foreign terrorists since the first World Trade Center attack, and for domestic terrorists since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. From Madrid to London, Bali to Mumbai, and Baghdad to Kabul, the IED is the global tactical and strategic threat to Americans and our allies. Directions for making pipe bombs and other types of incendiary devices, and this is kind of interesting to note and kind of scary, can be found on the internet. From 1978 to 1996, Theodore Kaczynski excuse me, terrorized the country as the Unabomber threw a string of 16 mail bombs that killed 3 people, apparently in protest against technology. So when you kind of look at that, it's kind of scary. Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, found guilty of masterminding the first World Trade Center bombing in 1993, declared that he was proud to be a terrorist and that terrorism was the only viable response to what he saw as a Jewish lobby in Washington. The car bomb was used to shatter the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in 1995. That was Timothy McVeigh's way to protest the government and the raid on the Branch Davidians in Waco. In 2002, Lucas Helder terrorized the Midwest with 18 pipe bombs placed in mailboxes across 5 states, leaving anti-governmental letters with the bombs. 6 of those exploded, injuring 4 letter carriers and 2 residents. And the most horrific act of terrorism against the United States occurred on September 11, 2001, when 2 airplanes were used as missiles to explode the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Excuse me. Another plane was used as a missile to attack the Pentagon. And the 4th plane, we know, crashed in a field in Pennsylvania before it actually reached its intended target. So, methods: arson, explosive bombs, weapons of mass destruction, technological terrorism, kidnapping, hostage takings, active shooters. Okay, all of these types of things, suspicious packages, suicide bombers. These are all these things that are in here, and they have a huge impact on you and law enforcement trying to do what you can do to make sure that we're fighting the good fight against this. So suicide bombers, just so you know, potential suicide terrorists may come from different backgrounds and different age groups, and maybe male or female, educated or uneducated, an upstanding citizen or not. Most suicide terrorists believe that act makes them a martyr and ensures them a place in their version of heaven. Their families are usually held in reverence and taken care of financially. Suicide bombers try to kill as many people as possible and often have a well-oiled machine behind them that relies on a recruitment procedure using the values of the community as religious justification. So the myth out there is that suicide bombing is a relatively ineffective method of attack when compared to other methods, which actually is not true. So suicide bombers can be extremely difficult, if not impossible, to thwart, given their determination to serve their cause and the fact that they may have already endured significant loss in their lives. So weapons of mass destruction include things like biological, chemical, and nuclear agents. And the biological agents would fall under the realm of what we call bioterrorism. So bioterrorism involves such biological weapons of mass destruction as anthrax, botulism, smallpox, salmonella, natural poisons, viruses. So the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, reports that at least 10 countries were believed to possess or be conducting research on biological agents for use in weapons of mass destruction. So the U.S. response to 9/11. How do we deal with this? So, although the methods used by terrorists have not changed much over the years, a little bit, but typically not that much, the U.S. response to the threat of terrorism has changed drastically since 9/11. On October 8th, 2001, President George W. Bush signed Executive Order 13228, establishing the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, making Homeland Security basically a household word. Homeland Security encompasses the most sweeping reform in government in nearly a half century and makes explicit the realization that the evolving international security landscape bears directly on our domestic security. So, the U.S. Patriot Act, on October 26, 2001, President Bush signed into law the Uniting and Strengthening America by Providing Appropriate Tools Required to Intercept and Obstruct Terrorism Act. Simply put, the U.S. Patriot Act, giving police unprecedented ability to search, seize, detain, or eavesdrop, or listen in on, their pursuit of possible terrorists. So the Patriot Act significantly improved the nation's counterterrorism efforts by, 1, allowing investigators to use the tools already available to investigate organized crime and drug trafficking. 2, facilitating information sharing and cooperation among government agencies so they can better connect the dots. 3, updating law enforcement to reflect new technologies and new threats. And 4, increasing the penalties for those who commit or support terrorist crimes. The U.S. Patriot Act also included money laundering provisions and set strong penalties for anyone who harbors or finances any type of terrorist activity. So when you look at page 398, and it's under figure 10.5, it's a organizational chart for the Department of Homeland Security. So if you take a peek at that, it'll show you the actual organizational chart on how that goes. Along with that, just a couple other really interesting dates that you need to know about. On February 27, 2010, President Obama extended the U.S. Patriot Act for one additional year, adding 3 different provisions. Somewhat controversial, but adding these provisions. Number 1, authorizing court-approved roving wiretaps that would allow surveillance on multiple phones. Number 2, allowing court-approved seizure of records and property in anti-terrorism operations. And number 3, allowing surveillance conducted on lone wolf non-U.S. citizens engaged in terrorism that may be associated with a recognized terrorist group. So, that while a couple of them seem a little bit controversial, you can probably see why that those were enacted. And also in the response to 9/11 was kind of updates, upgrades, or whatever to the National Incident Management System, or NIMS. Although most emergency situations are handled locally, when there's a major incident, help may be needed from other jurisdictions, state and federal government. To that end, the National Incident Management System, or what they call NIMS for short, was developed in 2004 to enable responders from different jurisdictions and different disciplines to work together more efficiently and effectively when responding to a natural disaster, an emergency, or even an act of terrorism. So, in a nutshell, to try to tell you what NIMS kind of is, NIMS is a comprehensive, nationwide, systematic approach to incident management, including the incident command system, multi-agency coordination systems, and public information. It's also a set of preparedness concept and principles for all hazards, meaning no matter what the incident is, there is a set of concepts to follow. There is essential principles for a common operating picture and interoperability of communications and information management. Standardized resource management procedures that enable coordination among different jurisdictions. Scalable, so you can use it for any type of incidents, small to large. And it is a dynamic system that promotes ongoing management and maintenance. So this system basically means that whether you're from Rialto, Los Angeles, Palm Springs, or whatever, if there's a huge incident and you have fire, PD, city crews, state people, federal people all show up at the scene of this big, huge earthquake, there's one system, one comprehensive system or approach that they work under. And that makes it easier for people to manage that type of event. So hopefully that kind of made sense. Some drastic changes that came out were things like the National Response Framework, or the NFR, which provides kind of the nuts and bolts for implementing NIMS. This comprehensive national all hazards approach was written for government executives, private sector businesses, and non-governmental leaders and emergency management folks. Along with that was the National Response Plan. So NIMS and NRF, which is the National Response Network we just talked about, outline how to handle disasters, whereas the National Response Plan, okay, the NRP, defines the federal government's role in responding to domestic emergencies. Then there's intelligence gathering and sharing, the National Emergency Communications Plan. And I know there's a lot of plans, and that's why I'm just kind of taking them one at a time here so you don't get lost. Communication should be the #1 priority at any terrorist preparedness plan, and it is also #1 in collaboration among local, state, and federal law enforcement agencies. An extremely valuable resource for investigators is the Regional Information Sharing System program, which assists state and local agencies by sharing information and intelligence regarding terrorism. So you can see all of these things that we're using, okay, in order to collaborate to deal with all the terrorism issues. Now, if you look on page 42 in your book, you can see a diagram. It's under figure 10.6 on page 402. It's the active collaboration kind of a chart, if you will. And it will show you exactly how these things are to function. So the critical role of law enforcement in Homeland Security. So before I get there, let me back up real quick. On page 404 of your textbook, there's an area called Addressing Obstacles to Intelligence Sharing. And this is important. So there are 2 barriers to effective exchange of intelligence and interoperability issues already discussed, and the lack of deconfliction protocols. Now, a deconfliction protocol essentially provides guidelines to avoid conflict, jurisdictional squabbles, and all those archaic rules that prevent cooperative working relationships between different levels of government. So deconfliction, when you see that word, you can just think of avoiding conflict. That's what that means. The keys to combating terrorism lie with the local police and the intelligence they can provide to federal authorities. How readily information is shared between agencies at different levels, and the interoperability of communication systems should an attack occur. And underneath that, addressing obstacles to intel sharing, in your book is a chart, figure 10.8, that shows you the information flow, the tactical intelligence flow, if you will. And it would probably be really good for you to take a look at that. So as we get close to the end here, what is the critical role of law enforcement? Well, Homeland Security issues will have a tremendous impact on policing during the next several decades. We know that. Law enforcement will be expected to divide its current efforts focused on the traditional core mission of policing, because it has augmented the existing job with added expectations by the citizens to develop prevention measures for domestic and homeland security. So local police officers' responsibilities related to homeland security include things like knowing the enemy, what to look for, and being vigilant, completing suspicious activity reports and sharing information, taking all possible steps to prevent any type of terrorist attack, preparing themselves. The department and the community for an attack, should one occur, through education and training, responding to an attack, and of course, investigating an attack. So these are all added expectations other than what we're already doing, being proactive and forming partnerships. All of these things are things that we need to really do in order to kind of hold the line, if you will. And keep in mind that when you talk about responding to terrorist attacks, you need to know that the first line of defense really is the first responder. It's police, it's fire, it's emergency medical professionals. All of these people are folks that are on the front line, and have the job every day of not just policing their cities and doing what they normally do, but all of those added expectations that I just went through that talk about being vigilant. Law enforcement officers must be aware of the possibility for contact with terrorists at any time during their normal course of duty. Many of the 9/11 hijackers had contact with law enforcement officers in various parts of the community. For example, on September 9th, 2001, Zayed Jarrah, hijacker of the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania, was stopped by police in Maryland for speeding, was issued a ticket, and released. In August 2001, Hanai Hanjour, hijacker and pilot of the plane that crashed into the Pentagon, was stopped by police in Arlington, Virginia, issued a ticket for speeding, and released. Now, that doesn't mean that the officers weren't doing their job, but these are folks that just blend in. And if maybe there was a better system in place to where we could really share more information, maybe we could have got something ahead of the game. But I mean, it just goes to show you that some of these people will have contact with police, fire, or EMS at some particular point. So the better we are with sharing information, definitely the more prepared that we can be. So when we investigate terrorist attacks, it is somewhat similar to how we would do regular operations relating to gangs or other criminal enterprises. So we would do undercover operations to try to glean intel and information, develop informants, domestic and international fronts. So we would do it both here and abroad. We would coordinate between various agencies, making sure that we were forming those partnerships to get as much intel as we could. And look at those groups that we know that are possibly involved in funding for terrorism, like organized crime, or in some cases, even some different charitable groups. So when we talk about terrorists and criminals, the importance of knowing one's enemy can't be overemphasized. One critical dimension of this knowledge is differentiating the street criminal from the terrorist. Terrorists operate with different motivations, have different objectives, and use much deadlier weapons than the typical street criminal in most cases. Most terrorists are first-timers. In addition, terrorists seek wide-scale damage, whereas criminals seek gain. And if something gets in the way of that gain, then they'll do what they need to do. Another crucial difference here is that with a terrorist, it is more often a matter of life and death. It's kill or be killed, not capture and convict. The fight against terrorism has blurred the line between crime and war, drawing law enforcement directly into the war. So you can see the difference there between like just the regular average criminal, if you will, and a terrorist. So as we fight this fight, we do need to have some, we have to be concerned about what we're doing. The Department of Homeland Security recognizes the importance of preserving liberty and privacy in this country, but the public expects law enforcement to deal with a terrorist threat. Former DHS Secretary Michael Chertoff once said, quote, "Law enforcement must adapt and be practical to ensure we preserve what is the most basic civil right, which is the right not to be blown up," unquote. Two concerns related to the war on terrorism are civil liberties may be jeopardized, and that people of Middle Eastern descent may be discriminated against or become victims of hate crime. So we have to understand that not every person that is of Middle Eastern descent is a terrorist, just like not everybody walking down the street that's wearing red or blue is a Blood or a Crip gang member. Okay, and that's why developing proper intel and information is extremely, extremely important here. So finally, challenges. As Police Chief Bratton, everybody probably has heard his name before, as Bratton cautions here, the threat of terrorism is clearly not going away, and while we have been very fortunate, there has not been a successful effort since 9/11. Well, that's not necessarily true. We've had some other big things that have come up. Every indication is that these attacks are going to increase, and in fact, they will occur. Now, that was written in 2010, so you tell me, was he right? He absolutely was right. Okay, so we had the 9/11, okay, and then here's Bratton telling us, hey, you know what? This stuff is going to occur again. The irony, of course, is that because of counterterrorism efforts, there have been no successful attacks on U.S. soil, at least of the magnitude of the 9/11 attacks in more than 10 years. Okay, but there have been a lot of other attacks all over the place, and we'll talk about some, leading some administrators down a dangerous path of complacency in thinking that they can or should cut back on the resources allocated to this issue. Well, think in the last year to year and a half, those types of active shooter or terrorist incidents, whether it's San Bernardino, whether it's Florida, whether it's Louisiana, whether it's Dallas, okay, and whether it's overseas in Europe, okay, think of them all and realize that Bratton truly was correct here. The dual challenges in combating violence facing law enforcement are countering terrorism while continuing to address crime and disorder, meaning that we have to do both. So that makes it very, very tough. So in summary for today, the threat of terrorism has become a reality in the United States. The FBI classifies terrorist acts as either domestic or international. As a result of 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security was established. The U.S. Patriot Act significantly improves the nation's counterterrorism efforts, and the first line of defense against terrorism is the patrol officer in the field, and that is absolutely true. With that being said, that's going to complete our lecture for this evening. And if you have any questions, go ahead and post them on the general discussion board. Otherwise, I will talk more at you next week. Until then.